In this build video, my diorama is inspired by the amazing artist by the name of Simon Stålenhag and his amazing world called the Electric State. And it's this image that I'm using the inspiration for my diorama. I really like the idea of this cat-like cartoon on a robot, but the scene will be very, very different. This is a mech bot 3D file that I bought from Loot a little while ago, and the pose is perfect for what I need to use it for. Using the 3D software called Blender, I'll make some modifications to it. First thing I need to do is find myself a head, and I did that on Thingiverse with this cat little figurine. So I'll chop off the head from the body and I'll use that. I also found myself a Mickey Mouse file, and this is going to be perfect for the hands and the feet, and his pose is extremely close to what I need. So he's pretty much spot on there. And you can see the modifications I did there. I added the head and the hands. But there were a few other things that took a bit of time to do. Now it took me about 2-3 hours to create that, and you can see the combination of the two. That the one on the left, the original mech bot, has got a gun there, so I had to remove that. I duplicated his right arm to his left, changed over the head, the hands like I mentioned earlier, and some of the other modifications I'll do using Greeblies. I then send the completed files to a Chitterbox where I need to slice it for my 3D printer. And you can see I've got 3 boats there. I also found them on Thingiverse. And the great thing about Thingiverse, everything on there is free. I then transferred the file onto a USB stick and stuck it into my Sonic Mega 8KS from PHROZEN, and using the really simple interface on the machine, I just told the machine to go ahead and print it. Now it's a pretty big file. It took about 24 hours to print. With the great technology of time-lapse, you don't have to sit there for 24 hours to watch it print. The PHROZEN printer has this really cool hook there, so you can leave the plate on an angle and let it drip off the excess resin. With the PHROZEN's perforated plate, I've never had an issue where the prints haven't stuck to that plate. On the contrary, it takes a bit of force to remove the prints from that plate. Bit of an effort there. Once they're off the plate, I give it a wash in some old IPA that I have in this bucket, and that just removes all the excess resin, the gunky stuff that's on there still. Once that's done, it goes into the PHROZEN wash machine, and that's the Mega S. It's got such a huge volume inside of it, I can put in quite a few prints and do them all in one go. The twin impellers on the bottom of the bucket do a great job cleaning the final bits of that resin off the model. Now normally I set the timer for about 10 to 15 minutes on high. They're pretty big pieces, so high is more than enough. It washes them really thoroughly and quite quickly. Then I get a little beep telling me I'm ready for the next step. Now here I usually just pull it out and let it drip dry for maybe about 10-15 minutes before I go into my next step. And off camera, what I normally do is give it a wash in hot water, and that's when I remove the supports. It then goes into this huge curing machine, again from PHROZEN, huge volume area. Again, I can do quite a fair bit in one hit. This machine gives me the ability to dry the parts and then cure it. Now normally on the curing I do, I don't know, about 5 minutes, and about the same actually time for the fan to dry out the parts. Hit start and it goes through the process. First thing it does, dries everything out and goes into a cure mode for whatever time one sets, and then once that is done, it's done and we're just about ready to actually start building the diorama. This whole PHROZEN setup I have gives me a really great workflow. And there it is. As you can see, I did a bit of work off camera. I filled in some areas, filled in those eyes and the nose just to give them more of a flat surface because I need to paint a face onto that head. I printed 3 boats just in case I screw one up. The concept of my diorama is this robot that tows this small little barge across a very polluted river. I'll be using some deep pour resin for the river. With all 3D printed files, there is a bit of preparation to do. As you saw earlier, I had those filled in areas, so we need to file it all down and also give it a bit of a sanding so it's really super smooth. Luckily, there's very little to sand on this particular print. By the way, I sell these tool and paint modular systems on my website. Go check it out. When I'm sanding resin, I prefer to use the wet and dry system to keep the dust to a minimum. So far so good. Hindsight being 2020, I should have chopped off the hands in Blender. I purposely did print the replacement hands separately, simply to make the painting process a little bit easier because they're going to be white. Originally I wasn't going to replace the feet because I thought in the water, in the murky water, you probably won't see them. Then I realized, yes you will, because it's not going to be that deep. So once I chopped off the hands, a bit of filing to flatten it out so I get a better surface. And you know, it kind of looks a bit weird. There's something wrong with that connection between the hand and the rest of the arm. I have a think about that one. The feet was just a straightforward chop off, and I'm going to use some greeblies like I mentioned earlier to do the connection between the foot and that leg. And this is from my Messerschmitt M62, I think it is. These are some of the greeblies left over, and a whole bunch of other ones that I had in my stash. This is what I ended up with. It looks great. Now I worked out the issue I had with the hand. It just needed a wrist. There we go, a bit of a base coat of some flat black. This primer is from Rust-Oleum. Now I need to do the head and the feet in a base color of white because I'm actually going to paint it a light blue. And trying to paint light blue on a black, it's going to take quite a few coats. This is the blue I'm using from Vallejo, and it'll suit perfectly with the theme. It still took about 2 coats to get this nice and even. There will be a bit of weathering to it as well. It's starting to look like it belongs in the world of the electric state. Quite happy with that so far. I like it. I've been dreading this next bit of the build. It's time to paint a face onto this mech. And I suck at doing faces, let alone cartoon faces, because I suck at drawing. So I'm penciling it out, trying to get a rough idea where I need to fill it in. And to fill it in, I'm using some of these Sharpie pens that I got hold of, I don't know, I think it was Amazon. And these are actually really cool pens. First time I've ever used them. And they came up really nice. A little bit rough. It took me a couple goes to get a nice round, oval for the mouth and the eyes. But I got there. I like the flow of these pens. I think I'll be using these a lot more often in my builds now. A lot handier than a bit of paint and brush. Now for the mouth, the mouth's a bit wonky. I did clean up as much as I possibly could. They come up alright. And here we go, the eyes. I spent so long on these eyes and I hated them. They came out shockingly horrible. So uneven and just lifeless, terrible. So I did have a backup plan. I decided to paint them all in white, and I ended up 3D, or not 3D printing, but rather just normal printing onto some decal paper. And just stuck them on, and look at that, what a difference. So much easier. I should have done that from the start. Yeah, I know, I probably could have done the whole face as a decal, but I really wanted to give it a bit of a go with some hand painting. Now these little things, would you believe, are actually noses, and I made them out of 2-part epoxy ribbon. I made some various sizes and I ended up picking out the ones that would suit. Bit of super glue to plonk it into place. And a bit of flat black to cover that nose. With that nose in place, I'm really happy with the look of him now. I super glued the hands in place. Really happy I added that wrist section there. Now for the first weathering wash, I'm just using some of this dark brown from Vallejo. Give it a spritz of water first to make sure that wash flows through all the nooks and crannies and gets a nice even run and doesn't pull up too much. Even though I've got about 3 different browns, different shades of brown that I use as a wash, I tend to go towards this dark brown all the time. Once it's dry, you can see it's got a nice grime to it now. From Ammo, I'm using some of their dry brush paint, and this is the gunmetal. Now I'm going to dry brush these quite heavily with that gunmetal. And these dry brushes are available from my store, so go check out the link in the description. Dry brushing is such a great technique, it brings out so much detail in the model. Now to add a bit of rust to it, I'm using some of these weathering pencils from AK, starting off with a dark brown. I randomly hit some of the edges around the body. I made sure I got a fair bit of this colour on the panel areas, and then using a bright orange I hit the very tips of those rusty areas that I'd laid down with the dark brown. So that's more of the newer rust with the brighter colour. Now let's move on to painting the boats. Base colour of that white, a nice even coat, and then I've masked off some of the edges, then using some of this red for the rest of the hull. And this will give me some really interesting stripes. And for the inside of the boat, I'm using some of this Russian grey. And I just used some reference photos just to give me a rough idea, some paint schemes, and I was happy with what I saw with these three colours. Once I peeled off the masking tape, it was then onto some weathering. It's a simple little paint scheme, but it looks pretty cool. I like it. Now I'm using some very fine grit. It's actually 800 grit. I'm just sanding through some of the top coats to give a bit of a wear, and back to that dark brown wash. After a bit of a spritz, I've just covered it completely with that wash. To create some rust, I'm using a combination of this sepia paint and the iron oxide powder from Vallejo, and this gives me a really nice textured paint to, as you can see, I'm sponging it to the hull, then going in with that bright orange and hitting the, some of the top ends there. Hitting it with that bright orange is a real game changer for the rust. It looks more realistic. Just using some of this timber, and this will be the top of my barge. I'm just scoring some wooden planks into it, and this is just a normal Tamiya scoring knife. I think it's Tamiya. I've got a couple of them, can't remember which one's which. And then with the hobby knife, scoring the ends so they look like they're planks. For the supports underneath that planking, some balsa wood there, and oops, a little bit too much super glue there, but that's okay. I just dip this piece and move it over to the other side. No wasted super glue there, even though it's like $2 for 8 of those tubes. Really cheap from Bunnings here in Australia. I'll wash off some very thin grey. This is my base colour for what will be very weathered timber. And look at that, it's that dark brown once again. Told you I use it all the time. But this time I'm actually going to use it with a combination of another colour. And that will be black. Giving it some streaks, and when it dries out, it comes out a lot lighter than that. I've got some leftover handrails that I had from a previous build that I did. They came out to be the perfect scale. Sized them up and just snipped them. If you haven't already, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel and hit notifications, and don't forget to share the video. Your support is greatly appreciated. To make painting a lot easier, because these pieces are so fine, all I'm doing is painting the feet of the handrails. I'll super glue them into place and then paint the rest. Even though these pieces are a bit fiddly, they're actually really easy to glue into place. Now I cut up the two sides, and to measure up the middle, that was the last piece that I did, and just trimmed them so it fit perfectly. Then used a bit of super glue to adhere those edges together, and it looks all uniformed. It looks like it's supposed to be there. Off camera I did paint it black, and just hitting it with the same rust technique as I did with the boat. I'm still learning how to do rust, but it is far superior to what it was, say, a year to 18 months ago, where I just used to use the one colour. Now it kind of, looks realistic. It's pretty cool. I'm happy with that. Off camera, I stuck those little boat hulls onto the platform of the barge. I give it a quick little layout test just to give myself an idea of what it's looking like. Now these are the figures I have laying around. Now all four of them I've actually used in previous builds, so I've resized them for this particular job. They're roughly about 1/48 scale, somewhere around there. I did print 4 figures and I'm not quite sure if I'm going to use them all. But they're there, so if I do, I do. If I don't, they'll go into storage for another build. I'm using some zenithal lighting to paint the figures, and I start off giving it a base coat of black, then from one direction painting some white, and this will give me my shadow areas. I then use a very thin wash and go over those painted areas. And this is what I end up with. At that scale, I don't spend too much time on detail on the faces. This is the base I created off screen. Use some foam for the base and some clear acrylic to hold the resin in place while it cures. To hold the 2 parts in place on the base, I'm using some of this bonding UV resin from RESIN. And all you need to do is just place a small amount onto the edges that contact with the base. Then using a small UV torch, it hardens the resin and keeps it in place. The great thing about this, it only takes about 5 to 10 seconds to harden. It hardens clear, so it's perfect for this job. To hold the barge in place, I'm using some of this 6mm acrylic tube. And again, I hold it into place using the UV bonding resin. Not only do I use this as a bonding agent, but I use it for filling resin models as well. And there it is, look at that, nice and solid, not going anywhere. I did give the base a couple coats of PVA glue, so hopefully that's protected the foam from the resin. To create the dark, murky, polluted waters, I'm using some of this resin from RESIN. It's a deep pour resin, which means you can pour up to 100ml or 4 inches in height. It's a 2-to-1 ratio, so it's 2 parts resin to 1 part hardener. One of the great things about this resin is virtually odorless, and I'm in a small but well ventilated area, so that's a big plus. Also, it's crystal clear. Now, I've used a number of different brands, and this one's turned out to be not only the easiest, but far the best quality that I've gotten out of the resin pour. And those of you who have been following my channel will know I've had a couple of failures with some of the previous brands. Even though this stuff is crystal clear, I do need to make it look like polluted water, so I'm using some of these inks to colour it. Doesn't take much, it only takes about 4 or 5 drops from each colour to get that murky shade. The more you add, obviously, the darker it's going to get. RESIN also supplied me with this really cool silicone mixing paddle, and what I'm doing here is just pouring it down that paddle just to avoid as many bubbles as possible. What I'm doing here is mixing up the second pour that I had to put in there because it didn't mix quite enough the first time around. To get rid of some of the minor bubbles in there, I'm just using this flame torch. It's really simple, you just hit it with the heat and they just pop and disappear. Normally what I do is I come back about every 15 minutes or so over a period of about 2 to 3 hours, and as they surface I pop them. This time I couldn't do it because I had a function to go to, so I had to take the risk and just do it for about half an hour before I left. After 3 days I returned, and lo and behold, my poor boy broke in half. I have no idea why that happened, but it did. Well, I ended up with some minor bubbles, but you can see most of it's actually very clear. If I didn't have to rush off to my function, they would have disappeared. Took a bit of strength to release the sides, but in the end I did get them. The reason these bubbles appeared was I didn't seal the base quite well enough, so the resin reacted with the foam base and created these bubbles. I don't mind it, it adds to the polluted look. The robot had a clean break, so that's going to be easy to super glue back into place. Not a problem. To create some of the waves, I'm using this stuff that I've never actually used before from Sellers, this all clear. So it'll be interesting how that works out. The previous brand that I used worked really well. The only problem was it was really thick, so it's quite hard to manage. To spread it out, I just use a paddle pop stick. Didn't take me too long, probably about half an hour to do this section. Built it up slowly, and look at that, it looks really good. I love the translucency of that resin, it's come up really well. The waves even look realistic. The barge platform accidentally popped off, but it turned out to be fortuitous because it made gluing the rest of the pieces onto a lot easier. These are some leftover barrels that I had from a previous diorama, and I ended up using all the figures and glued them into place. Next thing I needed to make was a base for my diorama, and I'm using a piece of software called Lightburn to create a template. Then I head over to my laser cutter engraver and just send it to the machine, and this cuts it out of 3mm MDF. And it takes about 2 minutes, just under 2 minutes to cut this out. I'm a big believer in getting the right tools to get the job done quicker and better. MDF is a great material to use. Like I said, it's only 3mm, so to assemble it, all you need to do is use a bit of super glue, and within minutes it's all together. And this is what it looks like when it's all together. Off camera, I do give it a bit of a stain and a bit of weathering, and the diorama just pops straight in with great ease. If I ever need to replace it, I can. Now I need the robot to be pulling onto the raft, so I've got this costume chain that I got from Spotlight here in Australia, and the stuff is like 60 cents a metre. It's really cheap tinny type chain, but it's great for jobs like this. Here I'm just adding some PVA glue to the chain to stiffen it up. Doing that just makes it a lot easier to paint and weather those chains. Start off with a base coat of black, and it's basically the same process as I did with that railing. I've just laid down some strips of white paper there just so I don't get any paint accidentally dripping onto the surface of that water. I used a hairdryer just to speed up the process of the drying time. I then added the base colour of the rust, and then hit some of the edges with some bright orange paint from Vallejo. I wanted these chains to look really rusty because they spend most of their time in the water. Leave a comment and let me know what you think about this build and all its rust so far. Final piece to this build is a name plaque. Created that in Blender and just printed it out on my 3D resin printer. Give it a base coat of black to start off with. Back onto the Sharpie creative markers. And I'm finding these to be really awesome. I picked this, what is it, a teal colour, bluey green colour? I don't know what it is. Again, let me know in the comments whatever it is. Onto the dark brown wash once again from Vallejo. And to bring out the rest of the detail, I'm hitting it with some dry brushing, again with that gunmetal that I used earlier. And finally a bit of super glue to hold that plaque in place onto the base. That's a really simple final addition to the diorama. Now that this little diorama is all finished, I think it's time for you guys to see the whole thing. I really enjoyed making this diorama and using a whole bunch of the techniques I'd learnt over the last, I don't know, 3-4 years. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. In the meantime, check out these other videos I've created, and you know what? I'll see you in the next video.